A little homeless girl begs Millionaire for help, then he notices something important and immediately takes action. Between the towering glass monoliths of downtown, John emerged from the grand entrance of a luxury hotel. The air was filled with the usual urban symphony, car horns honking in the distance, the chatter of passers-by, and the faint rumble of construction work echoing from a few blocks away. John, dressed in his signature eclectic style, sunglasses perched on his nose, made his way towards the sleek black limousine waiting at the curb. His chauffeur, a tall man in his 50s named Thomas, stood at attention beside the vehicle. With practiced efficiency, Thomas opened the rear door as John approached. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," Thomas said with a polite nod. "I trust you had a pleasant stay." John returned the greeting with a warm smile. "Morning, Thomas. It was fine, thanks. Looking forward to getting back home, though, but we still need to make one more stop for a photo shoot session." As John was about to slide into the plush leather interior of the limo, a small figure darted past him, moving with surprising speed. Before he could fully register what was happening, he felt something latch onto his leg. Looking down, he saw a little girl, completely bald, clinging to him with all her might. Her body trembled, and her eyes remained fixed on something in the distance, refusing to meet his gaze. Caught off guard, John gently placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "Hey there," he said softly, trying to catch her eye. "Are you all right?" Before the child could respond, an angry shout pierced the air. The girl's grip on John's leg tightened for a moment before she abruptly let go and fled without a word, disappearing into the crowd of pedestrians. A red-faced man in his 40s, wearing an apron emblazoned with the logo of a nearby convenience store, approached John. His eyes were still focused on the direction the girl had run, not yet registering who he was addressing. "That little brat," the man spat, his words laced with bitterness. "She's always hanging around my store, scaring away customers. Brings nothing but bad luck, I tell you." John raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Has she actually done anything wrong? Stolen something?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a hint of challenge. The store owner, still caught up in his rant, continued. "No, she doesn't actually steal anything. She just strolls through the aisles, looking and touching everything. Always touching, never buying. It's unsettling, I tell you. My regulars don't like it, and neither do I. I think it's all part of her plan, biding her time until I let my guard down so she can steal something." Mid-sentence, the man's eyes finally focused on John, and recognition dawned on his face. His anger evaporated instantly, replaced by a look of embarrassment and awe. "Oh my God," he stammered, his cheeks flushing a deeper shade of red. You're John Carter. I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't realize, and I didn't mean to—" John held up a hand, silencing the man's flustered apologies. "It's all right," he said, his tone measured. "But let me ask you again. Has this girl ever actually broken or disrupted anything in your store?" The store owner shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between John and the direction the girl had fled. "Well, no," he admitted reluctantly. "But she's always there. It's not right." John nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said, his voice taking on a gentle, almost philosophical tone, "I've learned in my life that it's not wise to judge people for crimes they haven't committed. Maybe there's more to her story than meets the eye." With that, John turned and slid into the waiting limousine. Thomas closed the door behind him, muffling the store owner's final, bitter retort. "I don't like you rich types anyway," the man muttered under his breath. "Never care about what's really going on in the world." As the limousine pulled away from the curb, John leaned back in his seat, his mind still on the strange encounter. The girl's frightened eyes and the store owner's misplaced anger lingered in his thoughts as the city scenery began to roll by outside the window. As the limousine merged into the morning traffic, John leaned forward, addressing his chauffeur. "Thomas," he said, his voice carrying a note of urgency, "could you drive a bit slower than usual? I want to keep an eye out for something." Thomas nodded, adjusting his speed accordingly. "Of course, Mr. Carter. Is everything all right?" John's gaze swept the streets through the tinted windows, his eyes sharp and searching for any trace of the little girl he'd just seen. "I'm not sure," he said, his brow knitted in focus. "There was a child back there. I need to make sure she's okay. She's bald, looks about 9 or 10 years old. Help me look for her." "Surely, sir," came the quick response, steady and reassuring. The city landscape rolled by at a more leisurely pace, bustling sidewalks filled with morning commuters, street vendors setting up their carts, and the occasional group of tourists already out exploring. John's gaze darted from person to person, looking for that small bald head in the sea of faces. Just as he was about to give up hope, he spotted a familiar figure huddled against the wall outside another convenience store on the next block. "Thomas," he said quickly, "could you pull over here, please?" The limousine came to a smooth stop and John stepped out onto the sidewalk, his signature sunglasses in place. He approached the girl slowly, not wanting to startle her. She sat on the ground, a small paper cup extended in front of her for donations. Her posture spoke of exhaustion and resignation, but as John drew near, her eyes lit up with recognition. John crouched down to her level, offering a gentle smile. "Hello again," he said softly. He reached into his wallet, pulling out several large bills and placing them in her cup. The girl's eyes widened at the generous donation, and without warning she lunged forward, wrapping her arms around John's leg once more. This time, however, the embrace was one of joy rather than fear. "Thank you," she exclaimed, her voice muffled against the fabric of his pants. Then, looking up at him with wonder in her eyes, she asked, "Are you a superhero?" John couldn't help but chuckle, the girl's innocence and enthusiasm warming his heart despite the sadness of her situation. "Not exactly," he said. "But tell me, what's a brave little girl like you doing out here all alone?" The girl's smile faltered slightly and she glanced around nervously before looking back at John. "Please help me," she whispered. John's hand moved toward his wallet again, but the girl shook her head vigorously. "Not money," she said, her eyes pleading. "I need—" Before she could finish her sentence, a small crowd started to form around them. Fans recognizing John approached with phones in hand, calling his name and eagerly asking for pictures. Some murmured questions, speculating about what the millionaire was doing with a homeless girl. The girl flinched, shrinking back as the growing attention overwhelmed her. A few fans pushed closer, unintentionally jostling John as they vied for his attention. Instinctively, John took a step back, his calm demeanor barely faltering as he moved toward the limousine. Thomas, ever watchful, stepped in swiftly. "All right, folks, give him some space," Thomas said firmly, his imposing presence cutting through the commotion. Guiding John with a hand on his shoulder, he opened the limo door and ushered him inside with practiced ease. Once inside, John glanced back through the window, his brow furrowed with concern as the girl disappeared into the crowd. "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry, but we should go. Your schedule—" Thomas began, his tone firm but polite. When there was no response, he leaned slightly closer. "Mr. Carter?" John eventually turned away from the window, his expression distant and preoccupied. "Yeah, I heard you," he murmured to Thomas, his voice unusually soft. His eyes flicked back to the busy street for a moment before he straightened in his seat. "I'll be back," he whispered under his breath, a quiet promise meant for the girl. As he spoke, Thomas signaled the driver to merge into traffic. Once they were moving again, John's phone rang. He answered to find an event organizer on the other end, confirming his attendance at an upcoming magazine photo shoot. "Yes, everything's still on schedule. I'm on my way," John assured them, even as his thoughts remained fixed on the girl he'd left behind. As he ended the call, he turned to Thomas with a determined look. "We have a few minutes to spare, right?" Thomas checked the time and nodded. "About 5 minutes, sir, if we're to arrive on time for your appointment." "Then let's go back," John said firmly. "There's something I need to do." The limousine smoothly navigated the city streets, retracing their route with practiced efficiency. John's eyes remained fixed on the passing scenery, searching for any sign of the little girl. As they approached the spot where he had last seen her, his heart sank. The crowd had dispersed and there was no sign of the child. "Pull over here, Thomas," John instructed as they reached the convenience store. "I'll be back in a moment." As John stepped out of the car, he turned to his chauffeur. "I'm just going to take a quick look inside the store. I won't be long." The bell above the door chimed softly as John entered the store. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the aisles of snacks and household items. Behind the counter, a teenage cashier was deeply engrossed in a mobile game, barely glancing up as John walked in. Moving quietly through the store, John scanned each aisle systematically, his eyes darting from shelf to shelf, looking for any sign of movement, any hint of the small figure he'd encountered earlier. The only sounds were the beeping of the cashier's game and the distant hum of the refrigeration units. After a thorough search yielded no results, John approached the counter. The cashier finally looked up from his phone, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized the man standing before him. "Excuse me," John said politely. "I'm looking for a little girl. Bald head, about this tall." He gestured with his hand to indicate the child's height. "Have you seen anyone like that in here recently?" The cashier's expression remained blank as he shook his head. "Nah, man, haven't seen any kids in here today," he replied. Without waiting for a response, he turned his attention back to his game. Disappointed but not deterred, John thanked the cashier and stepped back out onto the street. The afternoon sun beat down as he took several steps in each direction, scanning the nearby alleys and sidewalks. He was acutely aware that his time was limited before fans might recognize him again, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the girl needed help. After a few more minutes of fruitless searching, John reluctantly returned to the waiting limousine. As he settled into the back seat, he pulled out his phone, scrolling through his calendar and agenda. The list of appointments and commitments stretched out before him, a stark reminder of the demands of his professional life. Thomas started the engine, ready to continue their journey to the photo shoot. As the car eased down the street, moving toward the next block, John remained lost in his thoughts. "Maybe she's gone for good," he mused. The quiet hum of the engine filled the space until a soft knock on the window broke the stillness. Slowly he turned, blinking in surprise. There, just outside, was a small face pressed against the glass, tiny hands cupped around her eyes as she gazed intently into the tinted interior. His heart leapt as he recognized the little girl from earlier. Her bald head was unmistakable, even through the darkened glass. He suddenly realized that the limousine had come to a stop at a traffic light. His eyes darted to the traffic signal countdown, which showed only a few seconds remaining before the light would change. Without hesitation, John reached for the door handle, ready to speak with her again and finally uncover the mystery of her plea for help. "Come on," John said urgently to the girl, making a split-second decision. Without hesitation, he swung the door open and helped her into the back seat just before the light could turn green. The soft creak of the leather seats echoed as she settled beside him, her small frame seeming even more fragile against the plush interior of the vehicle. Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyebrows raised in surprise, but he said nothing as the light turned green and he smoothly accelerated. Inside the climate-controlled environment of the limousine, the girl seemed to relax slightly. Her wide eyes took in the plush surroundings, a stark contrast to the streets she had been inhabiting. John watched her carefully, noticing how she unconsciously rubbed her arms as if cold, despite the comfortable temperature in the car. "What's your name?" John asked gently, trying to put her at ease. The girl hesitated for a moment before answering in a small voice. "Sonia." "It's nice to meet you properly, Sonia," John said with a warm smile. "Now, can you tell me what kind of help you need?" Instead of answering directly, Sonia pointed through the window to a building they were passing. John followed her gesture and saw a large sign that read "Orphanage" on the front of an old, somewhat run-down structure. Before he could ask for clarification, Sonia made another gesture, this time more personal and troubling. She indicated her bald head and then pulled up her sleeve, revealing a dark, concerning mark on her arm. "Please help, sir," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. The plea carried new weight with these visual clues, and John felt a knot forming in his stomach as he began to piece together the situation. Leaning closer, John carefully studied the mark on Sonia's arm. His expression grew serious as he processed what he was seeing. The combination of her bald head, pale skin, and the suspicious mark led him to a sobering conclusion about her medical condition. "Sonia," he said softly, his voice filled with concern. "Are you sick? Is that why you need help?" The girl nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "The doctors at the orphanage said I need special medicine, but they don't have enough money. I've been trying to save up, but—" Her voice trailed off as she gestured helplessly at her meager possessions. The gravity of the situation settled over the car's interior like a heavy blanket. Without hesitation, John turned to address his chauffeur. "Thomas, can you find parking near that orphanage we just passed? We need to speak with someone there." "Of course, Mr. Carter," Thomas replied, already changing lanes to turn around. As the limousine approached the orphanage, John's attention remained fixed on Sonia. He noticed how she seemed to shrink into herself as they got closer to the building, her earlier bravery giving way to apprehension. "It's going to be okay," John assured her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We're going to figure this out together, all right?" Sonia nodded, managing a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The limousine came to a stop in front of the orphanage, and John helped Sonia out of the car. As they approached the entrance, he noticed her steps becoming slower, more hesitant. The short flight of stairs leading to the front door seemed to loom before them like a mountain. Just as they reached the bottom step, Sonia's legs gave out beneath her. John instinctively reached out to catch her, but she was already losing her balance. His grip slowed her descent, preventing her from falling too quickly. In a heart-stopping moment, she tumbled the last few steps, her small body crashing onto the pavement below. "Sonia!" John cried out, rushing to her side. He gently cradled her head, relieved to see that she was still conscious but alarmed by the trickle of blood from a cut on her forehead. Without wasting a moment, John pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services. As he quickly explained the situation to the operator, his free hand stayed on Sonia's shoulder, offering what little comfort he could while trying to keep her still. She was conscious. Wasn't that a good sign, he thought, but his mind raced with concern, hoping she hadn't broken any bones in her fragile little body. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across her pale face, highlighting the fear and pain in her eyes. John's heart raced as he waited for the ambulance to arrive, acutely aware of how fragile the little girl in front of him truly was. If you're enjoying this story of kindness so far, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It costs you nothing, but for us, especially in these early days, it means the world. Let's continue with what happens next. As John ended the call with emergency services, the front door of the orphanage burst open. An elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun rushed out, her face etched with concern. "Oh, dear Lord," she exclaimed, hurrying down the steps as quickly as her age would allow. "What happened? Is she all right?" John looked up, his hand still resting protectively on Sonia's shoulder. "She collapsed on the stairs," he explained quickly. "I've called for an ambulance." The woman knelt beside them, her movements surprisingly spry for her age. "I'm Miss Abigail," she said, her voice carrying both authority and genuine concern. "I'm the caregiver and owner of the orphanage. We saw what happened on our security cameras, and I came as fast as I could." Miss Abigail gently brushed Sonia's cheek, her eyes filled with a mixture of worry and affection. "Oh, Sonia," she murmured, "what have you gotten yourself into this time?" Turning to John, Miss Abigail's expression grew more somber. "I'm afraid Sonia has been diagnosed with cancer. Because of her condition, she's been experiencing weakness and imbalance. She falls quite frequently. We've been doing everything we can to manage her care, but—" Her voice faltered, trailing off as her eyes misted over with unshed tears. Before John could respond, The wail of sirens pierced the air. An ambulance rounded the corner, its lights flashing as it pulled up to the curb. 2 paramedics quickly exited the vehicle, wheeling a stretcher between them. As the paramedics began to assess Sonia's condition, her small voice broke through the commotion. "Mr. Carter," she called weakly, reaching out for John's hand. "Will you come with me? Please?" John's heart clenched at the fear in her voice. He glanced at Miss Abigail, who nodded encouragingly. "Of course, Sonia," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "I'll be right there with you." However, as the paramedics prepared to load Sonia into the ambulance, one of them turned to John with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can only allow one person to ride along, and it should be her guardian." John nodded in understanding, then leaned down to speak to Sonia. "Listen, sweetheart," he said softly. "Miss Abigail is going to ride with you in the ambulance, but I promise I'll meet you at the hospital, okay? My ship will be right behind you." Sonia's lip trembled, but she nodded bravely. "You promise?" "Pirate's honor," John replied with a wink, earning a small smile from the girl. As the paramedics loaded Sonia into the ambulance and Miss Abigail climbed in beside her, the doors closed and the vehicle pulled away. Its sirens were now silent, but the lights still flashed as it disappeared down the street. John turned to Thomas, who had been waiting quietly nearby. "We're going to follow them to the hospital," he said firmly. "Can you keep up with the ambulance?" Thomas nodded, already moving toward the limousine. "Of course, Mr. Carter. I'll make sure we don't lose sight of them." The limousine smoothly navigated the city streets, maintaining a respectful distance from the ambulance. John sat quietly in the back seat, his mind racing with questions about Sonia's condition, her life at the orphanage, and how he could help. The city passed by in a blur of buildings and faces, but John's focus remained fixed on the vehicle ahead, carrying the little girl who had so unexpectedly entered his life. The emergency room buzzed with activity as John made his way through the sliding doors. The antiseptic smell and harsh fluorescent lighting created a stark contrast to the warm afternoon he'd left behind. He approached the nurse's station, his presence commanding attention. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I'm here for a young girl who just arrived. Her name's Sonia." The nurse looked up from her paperwork, her expression softening as she recognized him. "She's being examined by the doctor now," she informed him, gesturing toward a curtained area. "Are you family?" John hesitated for a moment before responding. "I'm a friend. I brought her in." The nurse nodded sympathetically. "You can wait outside the curtain. The doctor should be out soon to give an update." As John settled into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs outside Sonia's room, he spotted Miss Abigail pacing nearby. Her eyes met his as he approached, and relief washed over her face. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice filled with gratitude, "I can't thank you enough for what you've done already, but I have to ask, what happens now?" John's gaze shifted from Miss Abigail to the curtain hiding Sonia from view, then back again. In that moment, the contrast between his privileged position and Sonia's desperate situation crystallized his resolve. "Now," he said with quiet determination, "we make sure Sonia gets the treatment she needs." Miss Abigail's eyes widened in disbelief. "But the cost? It's—" "You don't have to worry about that," John interrupted gently. "I'll take care of everything. Her treatment, hospitalization, whatever she needs to get better. No child should have to beg on the streets for a chance at life." Miss Abigail's voice trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Carter, I don't know how to thank you. This means more than you could ever imagine." Before John could respond, the doctor emerged from behind the curtain, his expression serious but calm. He introduced himself as Dr. Marvey, a specialist in pediatric oncology. "The good news," he began, addressing both John and Miss Abigail, "is that Sonia's condition is stable for now. However, her diagnosis, stage 3 malignant melanoma, requires immediate action. We need to perform surgery to remove the primary tumor and affected lymph nodes as soon as possible. After that, we'll evaluate the need for chemotherapy and radiation." Miss Abigail's face fell as the doctor outlined the extensive treatment plan. "Doctor," she began hesitantly, her voice trembling, "is she going to be okay?" Dr. Marvey gave her a reassuring look, his tone steady. "From our earlier tests, Sonia appears to be in good condition for the procedure. There's always a risk with surgery, but I believe we have a strong chance of success. However, it's critical we act quickly." John stepped forward, his voice firm but composed. "Doctor, I want Sonia to receive the best possible care, regardless of cost. Can you make that happen?" The doctor blinked in surprise, clearly recognizing John, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "Of course, Mr. Carter. We have an excellent oncology team here, but I must warn you, the expenses for this kind of treatment can be substantial." "I understand," John said resolutely. "Please proceed with whatever Sonia needs, and I'd appreciate it if we could keep this as private as possible to avoid media attention." Dr. Marvey nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "We always maintain patient confidentiality, Mr. Carter. Now, as for the timeline, we actually have a surgery slot available tomorrow morning. Given the malignant nature of Sonia's cancer, I'd recommend we proceed as soon as possible." John and Miss Abigail exchanged a look before nodding in agreement. "Let's do it," John said. "What do we need to do to prepare?" As the doctor outlined the pre-surgery procedures and necessary consent forms, John felt a mix of anxiety and hope. The urgency of the situation weighed heavily on him, but he was determined to do whatever it took to give Sonia a fighting chance. With the surgery scheduled for the following morning, John took a deep breath and prepared to enter Sonia's room. He clutched a small pirate hat and a golden trinket he had found in the limousine storage compartment, a small gesture he hoped might bring her comfort. As he stepped through the curtain, he found Sonia propped up in the hospital bed, looking small and fragile against the stark white sheets. Her eyes brightened slightly when she saw him. "Mr. Carter," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with genuine joy. John smiled warmly, settling into the chair beside her bed. "Hello there, Sonia," he said gently. "I hear you're about to embark on quite the adventure tomorrow." Sonia's smile faltered slightly, fear creeping into her eyes. "The doctor said they need to do surgery," she murmured. "I'm scared. I'm not as brave as you." John leaned in, his voice soft but steady. "Now, listen here," he said, taking her small hand in his. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means doing what needs to be done, even when you are scared. And from what I've seen, you're one of the bravest girls I've ever met." He reached into his pocket, pulling out the pirate hat and golden trinket. "I brought you something special," he said with a wink. Gently, he placed the hat on her head. It was slightly too big, slipping down over her eyes, but her giggle was worth it. "And this," he continued, pressing the golden coin into her palm, "is for good luck. Keep it close and remember that I'm rooting for you." Sonia's eyes widened as she examined the coin, turning it over in her hands with wonder. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Just then, Miss Abigail entered the room, followed by a nurse pushing a small TV on a cart. "Look what Mr. Carter arranged for us, Sonia," Miss Abigail said with a smile. "We're going to have a movie night." As the nurse set up the TV, John turned to Sonia with a conspiratorial grin. "How about we watch some real pirate adventures?" he asked, holding up a DVD. Sonia's face lit up with excitement but then fell slightly as she glanced at the IV in her arm. "But I'm not allowed to eat anything before the surgery," she said sadly. John didn't miss a beat. "Ah, but that's part of the adventure," he exclaimed. "You see, in this movie there are times when even pirates go hungry. It's all part of being a true adventurer. What do you say we brave it together?" Sonia giggled and nodded, her earlier fears momentarily forgotten in the excitement of the impromptu movie night. As the opening credits began to roll, John settled back in his chair, grateful for this moment of normalcy amidst the chaos of the day. He watched as Sonia became engrossed in the film, her eyes wide with wonder at the swashbuckling adventures on screen. Midway through the movie, a nurse entered to take some final measurements and blood samples for the surgery. To John's relief, Sonia barely noticed, too captivated by the adventures of the pirates to pay much attention to the medical procedures. For a few precious hours, the hospital room transformed into a world of pirate adventures and Hollywood magic. Sonia laughed at the antics of the characters, her spirits lifted by the joy of the story and the comforting presence of John by her side. As the movie neared its end, John noticed Sonia's eyelids growing heavy. By the time the credits rolled, she was fast asleep, the pirate hat tilted at a jaunty angle on her head, and the golden coin clutched tightly in her hand. Carefully, so as not to wake her, John moved to the small couch in the corner of the room and switched off the TV. As he settled in for the night, his eyes remained fixed on Sonia's peaceful form. In the quiet of the hospital room, with the soft beeping of machines providing a steady rhythm, John found himself reflecting on the day's extraordinary events. He thought about the appointments he'd missed, the potential career repercussions, and found that none of it mattered compared to the little girl sleeping before him. As he drifted off to sleep, John made a silent promise to himself and to Sonia. He would do whatever it took to see her through this battle and give her the chance at life and adventure that every child deserves. The first rays of dawn filtered through the hospital room's blinds when John stirred from his restless sleep on the couch. He blinked, momentarily disoriented, before the events of the previous day came rushing back to him. His gaze immediately went to Sonia's bed, where she was already awake, clutching the golden coin tightly in her small fist. "Good morning, Captain Carter," Sonia said softly, a brave smile trembling on her lips despite the fear evident in her eyes. John quickly moved to her bedside, gently adjusting the pirate hat that had slipped askew during the night. "Good morning, my brave little pirate," he replied warmly. "Ready for your big adventure today?" Before Sonia could answer, the door opened and a team of medical professionals entered the room, led by Dr. Marvey. They began the final preparations for Sonia's surgery, their movements calm and purposeful. Miss Abigail arrived moments later, slightly out of breath from her early morning rush to the hospital. She immediately went to Sonia's side, taking the girl's free hand in hers. "Good morning, sweetheart," Miss Abigail said, her voice filled with a mix of concern and encouragement. "Dr. Marvey is going to take very good care of you today. Do you remember what we talked about?" Sonia nodded, her grip tightening on both the coin and Miss Abigail's hand. "They're going to make me sleep, and then they'll take out the bad stuff in my body," she recited, her voice small but steady. Dr. Marvey smiled approvingly. "That's exactly right, Sonia, and when you wake up, you'll be on your way to feeling much better." As the nurses began to prepare Sonia for transport to the operating room, John noticed her panic rising. Her eyes darted around the room and her breathing became more rapid. Without hesitation, he stepped closer, taking her hand from Miss Abigail. "Hey there, First Mate Sonia," he said softly, slipping into his pirate persona. "Remember what we talked about last night? About being brave?" Sonia nodded, her eyes locked on John's face. "Well, this is your chance to show just how brave you are," he continued. "And do you know what? I'll be right here waiting for you when you wake up, just like a faithful captain waiting for his first mate to return from a dangerous mission. What do you say?" Sonia took a deep breath, visibly calming herself. "Aye, Captain," she whispered, managing a small smile. As the nurses began to wheel Sonia's bed out of the room, John walked alongside, maintaining a steady stream of pirate-themed encouragement. He carried the pirate hat and coin, promising to keep them safe until she returned. At the doors to the operating room, Sonia's fear resurfaced. She reached out for John, her small hand trembling. John knelt beside her gurney, speaking softly. "You've got this, Sonia," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "Captain Carter believes in you, and when you wake up, we'll have more adventures together. I promise." Sonia's grip on his hand loosened as the pre-surgery medication began to take effect. With a final drowsy nod, she was wheeled into the operating room, the doors closing behind her. John stood there for a moment, staring at the closed doors before turning to Miss Abigail. They shared a look of nervous anticipation before making their way to the waiting area. As they settled into the uncomfortable chairs, John's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to find several missed calls and messages from his agent, publicist, and various business contacts. With a sigh, he silenced the device, his attention focused solely on the operating room's indicator light. Miss Abigail noticed his action and gave him a sympathetic look. "Mr. Carter," she began hesitantly, "I can't help but feel that we're imposing on you. Your career, your obligations." John shook his head firmly. "Miss Abigail, please. This is where I need to be right now. Everything else can wait." The morning stretched on, the waiting room slowly filling with other anxious families. The shared atmosphere of hope and fear weighed heavily on everyone. Hours passed, marked only by the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional updates from passing nurses. John found himself pacing the small area, his eyes constantly drawn to the operating room doors, willing them to open with good news. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Marvey emerged, still in his surgical scrubs. John and Miss Abigail stood immediately, their hearts racing as they waited for the news that would shape Sonia's future. "The surgery was successful," Dr. Marvey announced, his voice carrying a note of relief. "We were able to remove the primary tumor and the affected lymph nodes." John and Miss Abigail embraced spontaneously, both fighting back tears of relief. "Thank God," Miss Abigail whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Dr. Marvey continued, his tone becoming more serious. "However, this is just the first step. Sonia will need ongoing treatment to ensure we've eliminated all the cancer cells. We're looking at a regimen of chemotherapy and possibly radiation, depending on how her body responds." John nodded, his expression determined. "Whatever she needs, doctor. Just tell us what to do next." As Dr. Marvey outlined the next steps in Sonia's treatment plan, a nurse approached to inform them that Sonia was being moved to the recovery room and would be waking up soon. "She'll be groggy from the anesthesia," the nurse explained, "but you can see her briefly if you'd like." John and Miss Abigail followed the nurse to the recovery area. As they approached Sonia's bed, they could see her starting to stir, her eyes fluttering open, unfocused at first, then settling on John. "Captain Carter?" she mumbled, her voice weak and slurred. John stepped forward with a warm smile and gently placed the pirate hat back on her head, careful to avoid the surgical sites. "I'm here, First Mate Sonia," he said softly. "You did it. You were so brave." A weak smile spread across Sonia's face as she drifted back to sleep, the hat tilted jauntily on her head. The golden coin rested in her small hand, a symbol of her courage and their unexpected bond. As Sonia rested, Dr. Marvey excused himself to attend to other patients, leaving John and Miss Abigail to discuss what lay ahead. Miss Abigail's voice was filled with gratitude, but tinged with uncertainty. "Mr. Carter," she began hesitantly, "you've already done so much. I don't know how we could ever repay you." John waved her concerns away with a firm but gentle tone. "I don't want repayment, Miss Abigail. Sonia deserves every chance to live a happy and healthy life, and I'll make sure she gets it." He hesitated for a moment, then continued. "But I've been thinking, it's not just Sonia. There must be other children in similar situations who don't have the support they need. I want to do more. Tell me about your orphanage." Miss Abigail looked at him, her eyes widening in disbelief. Taking a deep breath, she began to explain. "The orphanage is called Hope's Haven," she said. "We've been running it for over 20 years, but it's been getting harder with each passing year. The building is old, and we're constantly struggling to cover the costs of rent, food, and basic medical care for the children. Sonia's situation. It's just beyond what we can handle." John listened intently, his expression thoughtful as Miss Abigail continued. "We manage, but it feels like we're being squeezed out. We want to give these children a safe, comfortable environment where they can thrive, but the resources just aren't there." John nodded, his resolve solidifying with every word. "Miss Abigail," he said decisively, "I'm going to set up a fund, not just for Sonia's continued treatment, but for the renovation and expansion of your orphanage. In fact, I'd like to find a larger location where you can create a space that truly meets the children's needs. Maybe we could include a small clinic as well, so no child has to go without proper medical care." Miss Abigail's eyes filled with tears as she shook her head in astonishment. "Mr. Carter, I don't even know what to say. That's more than I ever could have dreamed of." John smiled reassuringly. "We'll work out the details together. But for now, let's focus on getting Sonia through her recovery." Later that day, as Sonia began to wake more fully, she spotted John sitting nearby. "Captain Carter," she whispered, her voice still faint but steadier than before. "Did we win the battle?" John leaned closer, his voice filled with pride. "We did, first mate, and now we're ready for the next adventure." Sonia smiled, her small fingers clutching the golden coin tightly. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." "Always," John replied, his voice low but firm. "I'll be here every step of the way." The hospital room, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had transformed into a haven of hope. As John looked around at Sonia, Miss Abigail, and the quiet bustle of the medical team, he felt a deep sense of purpose settle over him. This was just the beginning. A new chapter not only for Sonia, but for all the children who would benefit from the kindness and compassion sparked by this chance encounter. We all have the power to change someone's life, sometimes with just a small gesture of kindness, and in doing so we often find that we're the ones changed for the better. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on how you can make a difference today, because the world becomes brighter each time someone chooses compassion over indifference. Please, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe to our channel to hear more stories that inspire and remind us of the good we can bring into the world. Let's continue to create a ripple effect of kindness. Thank you for watching.